Thank you very much for coming. I'm Betsy Gottbaum, Executive Director of Citizens Union, and just to quickly tell you a little bit about what we're doing this year, we are very involved with trying to get even year elections. How about that? And that's going to be a very long project. We're working very hard on a very exciting new project because we suspended Gotham Gazette, and we are now working on a very exciting new project where we will be doing something quite fabulous in New York, we think. I'm not ready to tell you yet what it's going to be, but by the next board meeting, I will be ready, I hope. Otherwise, we're doing work on scaffolding. How do we get rid of some of this scaffolding, which is just incredibly upsetting, because the other day at my house, somebody crawled up the wall, climbed up the scaffolding with the cameras to take pictures in the house of the apartments. Well, if that isn't scary, I don't know what is. And what else are we working on? Anyway, now I get to
that's very funny.
I get to introduce my very dear friend, who is the highest vote getter in the state of New York, Tom DiNapoli, who has been the controller of the state since 2007. And he's a really, really interesting, but the thing that he is, there is nobody like him. There's not a nicer person in politics in New York State.
Thank you, Betsy.
Very accessible. If you ever have a question like, how much is something, you can even call Tom. And
I'll call my staff and they'll tell me the answer.
Anyway, Tom DiNapoli.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. Thank you. We've got a lot to talk about. You have been, as I think Betsy noted, an island of stability in a very tempestuous time in New York State politics. But just start out on the most basic level for folks. You know, what does a comptroller do? Just to level set.
Yeah, I'll try to do it fast, John. Thank you. Thank you for being part of the conversation.
Sure.
And Betsy, thank you for the great introduction and the longstanding friendship. When I first became controller and folks said I wouldn't last more than a week or two in the job, Betsy Gottbaum reached out to me, and especially in your role as pension fund trustee, as you recall, even gave me a bunch of reading material and said, this is going to help you be a good trustee for the pension fund. So thank you, Betsy, for everything you continue to do. So I'll start with that. One of the big responsibilities is serving as a trustee of the New York Common Retirement Fund, which is a pension, the money that supports the pensions for about 1.1 million New Yorkers who are state employees and local government employees outside of New York City. So that's investing the money and make sure the money's there, benefit administration. We serve as the chief fiscal officer for the state, so approving contracts, payments, that includes vendor payments, grants to nonprofits, money to go to local governments as well. We have an audit division, local government audits, state audit. We have a special office for New York City. Comes out of the New York City fiscal crisis that specifically looks at New York City finances, MTA issues, and so on. So we have a lot to do with state operations in terms of payroll, and some miscellaneous responsibilities, administering the 529 College Savings Program, the New York ABLE program for people with disabilities, returning people's lost money and unclaimed funds. So I'll sum it up by saying, our general responsibilities have to do with following the money, promoting transparency and accountability. My job in other states tends to be divided up to other offices, state treasurer, state auditor, a board to oversee a pension fund in New York for whatever reason historically, from when the office was first created in 1797. It's evolved to be a much more comprehensive responsibility. The secret is it's the best job in state government, which is why I stay in it, or hope to stay in it. But it is a job where most people aren't quite sure what it is we do.
No, I mean, it's everything that makes government work on a practical basis.
Well, a lot of it's, I say sometimes it's more the back office operation in some ways. If we screw up, you'll know about it, right? If you don't get your pension check or, so fortunately we don't have too much of that. But it is a very important part of the government process in New York State that unfortunately more people don't have a full appreciation for.
Well, I think, again, your tenure, the second longest serving comptroller in New York State history, in what has been a pretty chaotic time. So that itself, I think, stands out.
A lot of other folks have come and gone.
Yes, that is, yes, we can get into that. But what you do oversee is very much in line with what Citizens Union's priorities are historically, as New York's sort of, I think, premier good government group. But I want to talk about probably the most visible element of dysfunction right now, certainly in New York City, is the migrant crisis, because that has real practical and fiscal implications. Mayor Adams warning that this could lead to disaster for the city, not least of which is because of a $12 billion budget gap it opens up. This raises a lot of questions about, will the city be reimbursed? What's the state's responsibility in this? What's the federal government's responsibility in this? So just starting with your job as keeper of the books, how do you think the state should help the city? And what's the progress in getting money from the feds to help close this budget gap created by this crisis?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's a lot to say on that topic. Keep in mind, just in terms of context, I'm always very mindful that as controller, I have some very clear responsibilities which tend to be bigger picture. We're not a policy office, right? Mm-hmm. Not a legislator or the governor. And I was a legislator for 20 years where I had to have an opinion on everything. So I try very much to respect roles and try to give information out there to the public that helps to frame the broader discussion. So I set that, as a context. But I think you're right. This is obviously a crisis right now and a concern. So I'll offer the following observations. You can take it where you would want to go. I think first of all, we have to do a reality check. Have you heard that expression?
I've heard that phrase before.
New Yorkers are very compassionate people. And just about all of us came from somewhere else at some point, right? And so I think there's an appreciation for people that come here out of whatever the necessity is, right? Be it economic or political or otherwise. We look at our own family histories and we understand those stories. So I think we need to remind ourselves, that New York and the Statue of Liberty means something, right? And sometimes that gets lost in, some of the back and forth that's going on right now. But it's very clear that our programs, and to an extent our policies as well, federal level, city and state, we're not prepared for what, the influx that we have to deal with. So, it would seem to me that much of this needs to be considered a failure at the federal level, in terms of policy. It's not new to say we don't have a rational immigration policy. That's not a new discussion to this administration. The prior administration, it goes back, many, many years and many administrations. So that's one challenge, that we have to contend with. It's also very clear that the programs that were in place weren't adequate to the numbers that are coming in. So the real challenge right now is what will be the pattern as we move forward. I don't have any reason to doubt the mayor's projection, that over the next few years that could cost $12 billion to the city. That would throw the city's finances out of whack completely. There already were risks, to the city financial plan. The state financial plan now has $1.5 billion in for, paying for some of these services. The governor's indicated more money will be on the way. So part of the challenge is what will those numbers stabilize? Will they go down? And then what will be the long-term impact as far as the finances? From my perspective, obviously we look at the numbers and paying the bill. At one point early on, the city suggested there'd be a cost sharing of a third, mm-hmm. City, state, and federal. I don't think that's a bad starting point for a discussion. But, the challenge I think we have right now is you have a lot of finger pointing going different ways, and you need to have everybody step back, start to have a more thoughtful dialogue about how do we solve this, and do it in a way that is transparent in terms of sharing with the larger community what the solutions need to be in terms of programs, what the cost will be, and how we're going to pay for it. So I think we're still in the middle of trying to sort it all out, and then you have the overlay of legal issues, right? The right to shelter. What does that really mean? It was a consent decree here in the city back in '81. Is that the same as a court deciding? There are different lawsuits to try to clarify that. Should it apply statewide? What will it mean if it does? That we have it?
Right.
Well, I mean, we have it. I mean, it's a consent decree. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give you a legal analysis whether that consent decree should have the force of a final court adjudication. But, we have a lot of things that are, either in law or on the books as far as constitutional right. I mean, our state constitution calls for all our children to be educated. Fair argument that doesn't always happen. The voters just put a constitutional amendment to say that we're all entitled to clean air and clean water. Many of our communities have very high asthma rates because they don't have clean air. So, putting whatever you're going to say on paper, we still got to deal with the reality. What is going to be the program to deal with, the housing temporary? What is going to be the way to pay for it? And then more longer term, what do you do for these folks who, like my grandparents, came here and wanted to work? And that's where, again, you get to policy questions that I think revolve around, federal requirements. And I don't presume to be an expert on the federal laws in this regard, but it's very clear, and I think the governor and the mayor have been right to say, we need to expedite the authorization for these folks to go to work. There are jobs to be filled. And these folks, I think, would be ready, willing, and able, by and large, to fill those jobs.
And have you spoken to the governor about her decision to try to sort of unilaterally on a state level get rid of this federal 180-day work moratorium?
Well, it's a new story. I haven't spoken to her, this week about it. That will be open to legal question. I think her putting it out there hopefully puts more pressure on the federal government to respond, because I would think they could do something more expeditiously than they've done before. It's not just a New York problem. I mean, we're really feeling it here in New York, not just a New York City problem. We're feeling it here, but if we can get it right here, then that's a precedent for the rest of the country, right?
But there's no obvious solution for a $12 billion budget gap, or is it to,
Well, I mean, look, the city wants more from the state wants more from the feds. I mean, we're in that finger pointing stage right now. And at some point we have to get past that. And that number could change, right? So if we have some of these solutions to the challenge, that number could go down. If, on the other hand, I don't know, what was last week? Was it close to 3,000, I think, came in? If those numbers go up, the price tag could go up as well. And then you have the issue of how will that impact other programs? So the mayor, has put forward a program, for cost savings, 5% a year for the next 3 years. How will that impact on city services that we depend on to continue our recovery out of the COVID experience? So that's where, on the city, the need to be very clear about what will be the impact of those cuts, be transparent about it. How can we realize efficiencies to meet those needs? Look, the city's financial plan for the out years already had gaps.
Yep.
And we identified risks, beyond the gaps that the city had. And the state has growing budget gaps as well.
Let's talk about those gaps.
Yeah.
Before we get into more specific issues, where do you see the drivers of these out year sort of budget gaps that really represent, potential significant shortfalls in our solvency, as a city and a state, more importantly, particularly against the backdrop of here we are in Midtown Manhattan. What a lot of people are concerned about is a looming commercial real estate crisis because of COVID, and people not coming back to work and a lot of loans coming due. How much of an iceberg do you see that as coming at the New York economy?
Well, I think iceberg is a good way to describe it, but as with any budget projection, it's always subject to change. So keep that in mind.
Sure.
So you have a combination of factors, right? You have the federal relief money that really kept us afloat, both the city and the state and our localities. Well, that's now being spent down, and we don't expect another big infusion of money at that level. You saw a big bump up in the immediacy of the recovery from COVID, but that's somewhat stabilized. You certainly saw on Wall Street, we depend not solely by any means on the securities industry, but it's a big part of our revenue source for the city and for the state. Sure. And now the markets have been going in another direction. So part of what we saw at the state level certainly is a budget, the largest in the state's history, that was negotiated in the context of tax revenues that exceeded expectations and projections. Shortly after the budget was completed, the stock market started going down. The April 15 tax collection came in. Revenue was coming in below projections. So now at the state level, the Division of Budget has lowered the revenue projections by $5 billion for the duration of the financial plan. And right now, our projections actually are coming in slightly ahead the revenue rather is coming slightly ahead of the projections. But keep in mind, those are lowered projections, and the revenue is lower than it was a year ago. So trying to look forward about what will be the pace of the recovery, what will be the impact, as you mentioned, of the return to the city. The impact on commercial real estate will affect the city more directly than the state through property taxes and changed assessments. The state doesn't have a statewide property tax. So there's a lot in play now.
Are you concerned about the commercial real estate impact?
You have to be. I mean, the property tax is about 40% of the city's budget revenue. So, and commercial is a big part of it. So you could really see a challenge. Look, the other reality is, certainly at the state level, to an extent the city level, worthy programs were increased or created, some of that using the federal money. Again, with an expectation, whether it's on education or mental health or, other important needs that we'd probably all agree need to be supported. But the expectation was as the federal money would wind down, the economy would pick up, make up for the difference. That's not happening right now. So you then face the question of, do you have to curtail some of those very ambitious and appropriate spending commitments? Again, the need for transparency, disclosure to the public. If we are going to have to curtail spending in some area, what will be the impact on services? And then I'll just end on this. The other question that always comes up then is revenue. There's always a debate, should we raise taxes? Are wealthy paying their fair share? Fair debate about it. Get into that issue of taxpayer migration. Are we really losing so many of the wealthy people that some people suggest?
What's your take on that? Because we are competing against other states that don't have the kind of tax burden. The return on services is not evidently lesser in some of these states. They could things like pension obligations and Medicare reimbursements that account for that. What's your take on that threat to New York and the flexibility we have, given that so many of our obligations are non-discretionary budget items?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, certainly for the state, the top, rough numbers, top 1%, pay like 40% of the personal income tax revenue, which is the prime revenue source for the state. You get a little different mix with the city. And there is a net migration out of wealthier taxpayers. It is not the stampede that the critics suggest. So let's keep that in mind. Sure. There's still a lot of millionaires and even a few billionaires that continue to live here. Well, we want them, to continue to be here, but that has to be a concern. I think we need, and there's always a lag in terms of the data, right? So we need to look at, and I think there was probably more of a migration when COVID was at its peak. There were lots of reasons, if you could, to be somewhere else, right? So I think some of that has moderated. We have to look at the updated data. But, my concern, obviously, in terms of impact on quality of life, which has a lot to do with people living here, cuts in services have to be weighed very carefully. And we always have to look for efficiencies that don't cut the heart of the services. We do have to be mindful that tax policy can be dangerous in terms of driving people out who help pay the freight. But the third piece of it is what often happens, in my observation, after many years in government, is that if you don't want to cut services, and no elected official wants to, and you don't want to raise taxes, most don't want to do that either, you end up borrowing. And the reality is our state is one of the most indebted states in the nation. And at some point, especially, God forbid, if this recession that's always projected that never seems to happen, if that really kicks in, we're not as prepared, right? I mean, we have been building up our reserve funds, but John, that's another concern I have. You look at the city, if that $12 billion figure is correct, I mean, the city's contingencies could be wiped out just based on that. So the mayor is right to sound the alarm, but we have to get past all the alarms and really start to have a thoughtful conversation of what the costs are, what programmatic changes can we implement to reduce those costs, how can we assure a good quality of life for the individuals who are coming here, but also for the communities that are hosting those individuals. So there's a lot to contend with. It's not an easy time to be in government right now, but it is a time that cries for solutions, building consensus, transparency on what the alternatives are, and a fair dose of compassion as well.
Well, those are qualities that we desperately need, and I think you're right. All right, let's move on to some good government issues that I think overlap with your core area of responsibility. There's a lot of debate about pay to play. We have laws in the city that don't extend to the state. Some of these examples are pretty egregious, right? Donors getting massive state contracts with adequate oversight. There's some progress in Albany about proposing legislation, some predictable pushback as well. Where do you stand?
Well, I do think we need statutory changes. And there are some legislative proposals. We have actually drafted a legislative proposal, and we've been talking with Senator Myrie's office and Assemblyman McDonald's office that have, the current proposal that's out there. What I would like to see would be during a state procurement, that there be, from the initiation of the procurement till its conclusion, which would include any protests, a prohibition on any contributions to any statewide official, which would be the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, or controller, because those would be the offices that would have some impact on the procurement. And then for whoever would be the successful winner of that procurement, for there be a tail of 3 months, 6 months, some tail after that where there couldn't be a contribution. It would at the very least eliminate the appearance. Pay to play is a tough thing to prove. The courts often throw some of this stuff out if it ends up in court. So I think at the very least, the appearance question is a fair one. And I think the best way to eliminate that is to say you can't do contributions. We went through our own challenges. People remember the history, right? I'm in this position because my predecessor had to resign, ultimately was involved in a pay-to-play scandal with the pension fund. So we voluntarily said we won't, meaning me, take any campaign contributions from finance companies that do business or potentially do business with the fund. And that became the standard of the SEC that has now across the board for pension funds. It has made our operation cleaner in that regard. Makes it harder to raise money, by the way, for campaigns, but that's okay, because the priority is the integrity. And I think we need to do that with the procurement process. And I do think, another big interest of Citizen Union, and I do appreciate the great advocacy on all these good government issues, John, is the issue of how we pay for campaigns. Yeah. And, I know that's probably a topic you want to get into.
Yeah, that's exactly
so anyway, but bottom line, we have a proposal. We're talking to the legislators. There should be a prohibition during a procurement period where you can't do contributions. If you violate that, you should be debarred from doing business with the state.
Do you think they'll have the governor's support?
I don't know. I would hope so.
Let's talk about campaign finance, because you are, I think, one of the few, perhaps only statewide official who participates in the small dollar donation reimbursement, right? This is something that the city tried to champion, but has been largely discarded by or disregarded by politicians who choose not to opt in. Make the case for folks why you participate in that and why it's important to the integrity, political integrity of the state.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd say I think it's too soon to say because it's new as to how many folks are going to choose to not opt in, right? I mean, I was very pleased to opt in right away because I had advocated for this, for both when I was in the legislature and certainly when I became a controller. I felt that, again, if you want to reduce, probably can never eliminate the influence of money in politics, you need to not have folks who are running for office, especially incumbents who have a job to do, have to spend so much time raising money. Right. And New York, where for statewide, I mean, the limits are so obscene, 60 some, whatever the limits were last cycle was $65,000, something like that. You're always chasing money and it's wrong. It also disincentivizes competition. I don't come to politics as a wealthy person or big family connections, and probably had I not had that strange situation of being appointed initially, I probably would have never been able to aspire to a statewide office. So to me, leveling the playing field, encouraging competition, encouraging more people to be seeking elective office. One of our problems now is we don't have as many people coming forward, for lots of different reasons. But I think one of the barriers is that people feel unless they've got personal wealth, they can't really participate in the system. So I absolutely believe public financing, matching funds, incentivizing small donors is a smart strategy. We tried to get it, I said, back in 07, 08, 09, start with the controller's office. Some may remember there was a very failed last-minute experiment with the controller's office that I felt I couldn't opt into. My opponent did, he couldn't qualify. And a lot of folks said, well, see, we tried it, it didn't work. Well, thankfully, the legislature and the governor did put in place the opportunity for public financing. There was some concern, and I know Citizen Union had concerns about some of the amendments that were enacted during the session, hasn't been signed yet by the governor. But there was, from what I was hearing, the chatter, a real chance that the whole thing would have been delayed. Maybe, I don't know about scrapped totally, but at least delayed. So, we could argue whether the amendments, certainly moves away from some of the intent, but at least at this point, it looks like the opportunity is going to be there in 2024 for state legislative races. Will be there 2026 for the statewide races. I have opted in. Requires a lot more work in terms of keeping track of records, but that's okay. And I think the trade-off, for me is it gives me more time to do my job, less time to have to worry about raising money. Might it encourage more folks to run against me in a primary or general? Could. But, hey, that's what democracy is about.
What are your thoughts about open primaries as a means of increasing competitive elections in this state? Because we do have a problem with competitive elections.
You could argue it both ways. I've grown up in this system, and I do believe that there's a value in choosing a party. And I know party loyalty is, maybe not what it once was, but I still think it defines a lot of how people feel. I do have a concern with a very open primary that folks could come in a way that manipulates, right? They're voting a Democratic primary, not really because they're Democrats, but they think that they could help nominate somebody who would be easier, to be defeated. So there is certain value, I think, in keeping it, pretty clear as to what party you're in. I think if you make it easier, and we have changed some of the deadlines, but I think if you make it easier to change your enrollment, I would prefer that rather than just saying however you're enrolled, or if you're an independent, you could vote in any primary you want. I do have some concern about further diluting, the value of having the parties that we have.
When you say you had a qualifier there, was that Republicans shouldn't be able to vote in Democratic primaries and vice versa, or that independent voters should and perhaps should be able to vote in a Democrat or Republican primary, as we've seen a lot of confusion around competitive primaries?
Yeah, look, I always say to folks, if you should really choose a party. You could change which party every now and then, but you do, under New York's laws, you lose that chance for that vote to help determine who'll be on the final ballot. But I don't know that opening it up to anybody to vote in a primary, if you're not choosing a party, I don't know that there's any data out there that shows that would significantly increase participation. And I do think it means something to say I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, and I think people should make those choices, whatever that choice is.
Okay.
Don't sit on the sidelines and be a.
Well, we definitely don't. We want to get more people in the game. That's
no
one
question about it.
For it.
No question about it.
Let's talk about the previous governor, Andrew Cuomo, tried to restrict or pull back some oversight capabilities by the comptroller, focused specifically on CUNY and SUNY, I believe.
CUNY and SUNY construction contracts and centralized contracts, largely provided through the Office of General Services.
Yeah, and his argument was that this was all just taking too long, which seemed to be perhaps mildly self-interested in his part. Those have been restored. Walk us through that debate with the previous governor, and now that those have been restored, whether things are back on track to your satisfaction.
You want to bring me back to those days?
I think in the interest of transparency, yes.
No, look, he was successful, and you're right. And he didn't do it unilaterally. The legislature went along. So we have to remind everybody about that.
Why was that, by the way?
Because early in his tenure, he was a pretty persuasive governor. And it was done in the context of budget negotiations, and I don't have a seat at the table in budget negotiations. I don't have, again, part of the challenge of the role is I don't have a vote or a veto, right? I could say, hey, folks, what are you doing? But at the end of the day, if, as we all know, in Albany negotiations, there's always a lot of trading back and forth. And if you're not somebody there at the table with something to trade or withhold, you're probably going to be dealt out. And that's exactly what happened in terms of that role. And I think at the very least, it took away an important deterrence for the opportunity for corruption. And certainly we saw as part of the monies that went out, in some of the state grants, and again, putting aside some of the recent court decisions that have changed some of those outcomes, there was a sense that if folks aren't looking, including money flowing through through SUNY that hey, if we could do something that benefits us directly, why not? So, the good news is we did get that authority restored, and the SUNY and CUNY contracts were a lot of the focus. I think because of some of the problems that happened, but the bigger money was in those big centralized contracts. So again, I think to your point, the question done under the umbrella of it's more efficient. Well, in fact, we turn around contract approvals in less than 2 weeks, and if it's a real emergency, our folks can do it in 24 hours if need be. So I think it was an argument that really didn't make any sense. It would be an extraordinary situation if we would have to go way beyond that if it was a very complex kind of contract. But I would say this, fast forward to today. So let's not just talk about the previous governor. Under the current administration, in the current budget, not to the magnitude, but we were written out of about $5 billion worth of contracts.
Why?
Good question. I don't have an answer. And I felt once we had our powers restored, why would you start messing with that again? Because I think ultimately, besides protecting the taxpayer interest, which is our goal, get the best value for the state, you protect the executive as well.
Yep.
And an even more clear example of that, it's not just what may happen as part of a budget process, right, statutorily. You have these emergency orders, right? So during COVID, how many emergency and how much money flowed out that did not go through the normal procurement process? And we know some of that money went to the wrong places, right? If we had been in the loop on this, and maybe you could argue in the very beginning when everybody was frantic for PPE and ventilators and so on, but that emergency period kept getting extended. So we were cut out of huge amounts of money. Which was a mistake. And now now we talked about the migrant issue earlier. Again, an emergency period, contracts going out that don't go through our purview. So then we get calls from the press, well, what about that money? Well, we weren't part of it. Yeah, I mean, at the end, there's a payment, but one of the other arguments that was used in the past was, well, the controller could always do an audit. Well, what good is it to do an audit after the contract is signed and the payments are already out the door? And you can say, well, gee, we could have gotten a better value. Better that you have that authority up front and stop a bad deal from happening, or stop a payment from going through, so that you avoid having to just look backwards in an audit where you really don't have any power to influence a change anymore. So I think this is going to be an ongoing issue. There's always a desire, it's a natural thing on the part of any executive to want to have more, discretion reserved to them.
But to your point, it's actually, it performs a service for them in terms of protecting them.
I try to make that case all the time, because that way, if we didn't pick up on something, you could say, hey, well, the controller signed off on it. Yeah. Why are you yelling at me?
What were the $5 billion that were exempted covered?
It was some education, some mental health programs for special needs children, some miscellaneous categories, I think somewhere in the Department of Health. Yeah.
I want to get to questions from our audience, but I've got a few more questions for you. I mentioned at the outset, you have been the sort of island of stability in a very tempestuous time in our politics. And a lot of the people that, were in politics when you were, tapped to replace Alan Hevesy in 2007, they themselves have gone to prison or been shuffled off. Do you think there is a problem with a culture of corruption in New York State? And if so, why? And what can be done about it?
Well, I mean, if you look at the track record, you would probably have to say that there is, right? I mean, you're talking about, we won't even get into the legislature, but you can. Legislative leaders, at the highest level. And in my tenure in the years we're talking about, I mean, you had a controller resign, governor resign, lieutenant governor resign, attorney general resign. This kind of shakes confidence, right?
Yeah.
You wonder why people don't want to run or vote, right? If they think of this. That being said, in the more recent history, there has been less of it. Putting aside Lieutenant Governor not too long ago resigned, and that case is still pending, obviously. But I think part of it is, I think on the legislative side, I think this was appropriate. We did have the salaries increase, and so the desire for petty thievery, which was what some folks got involved with over the years, is less so. You've also seen, contrary to what people may assume, a huge turnover. You have a younger group of legislators now, and I think some of them are not as into the old way of doing things, and I think that's positive. I think looking forward, the change as far as the opportunity with public financing of campaigns will also be a benefit. I do have a concern, very timely issue now. You saw the other day that a court threw out our ethics, the Ethics Commission, which has gone through several iterations. And so now, who's going to enforce the ethics laws that we have now? Who's going to accept my financial disclosure forms? And also, by the way, enhancements in disclosure also, I think, have been helpful. So, again, that quagmire of how we oversee ethics in our state is thrown in disarray once again. And now, obviously, that case will be appealed, and there are questions of severability. But that's a concern, because if you could argue, and there are many good arguments, that past iterations of the Ethics Commission was a toothless tiger and didn't do anything. But this latest iteration was an attempt to be more independent, and it's like it got killed off at birth. And that's a problem, and that's a real problem.
So I want to end on a fun question before.
Those were all fun questions.
Well, but a really fun one.
Okay.
Which is I know that your current role isn't policy oriented. It's oversight, it's efficiency, it's transparency, it's fiscal guts of the state. But I was doing some research. You were actually the youngest elected official in New York State. 18.
First 18-year-old.
The first 18-year-old.
Yeah, 5 years ago.
So, given all that you've sort of observed and learned in your career, just blue skying, if you had the ability to sort of unilaterally make 3 policy changes in New York State that you think would be to the betterment, long term, stability, growth, et cetera, what would they be?
Wow. Well, I don't want to sound self-serving, but especially because of all the challenges out there, securing the role of the controller's oversight and not having it be continually compromised, because even in terms of what I talked about with the ethics blow up right now, in many ways our office is the key place that's charged with following taxpayer money and rooting out if there are opportunities that are being taken advantage of for corruption, to be the one, work with law enforcement, AG, DAs, and so on. So I'd say figuring out a way to enshrine more clearly what this role is to be better appreciated. Again, it may sound self-serving, but I think that would be good. I think we need to do again, may sound wonky, but I would urge Citizen Union to take a look at our polls in this regard. We really do have to get a much better handle around debt and how we manage it on our state. We have way too much debt that is not followed what was intended in the state constitution, which would be for the voters to approve it. So 95% of the debt is done through backdoor borrowing through public authorities without any clear level of accountability or the kind of transparency that should be there. So I would say a significant change as far as debt reform. And again, we have a proposal in that regard. What would be a third thing? I would like to think there might be a way, and it may sound old-fashioned, to get back to what inspired me to get first involved and to run for office at age 18, to have our young people be instilled with some sense of what civics is about and civic responsibility. I think we've really fallen down in that regard, and because the system only works if there's a continual renewal of people involved in it. And generally speaking, there's some years where it's different. Our youngest citizens are the ones who are least participating. And some of that has to do with their own pressures and so on. But I mean, I did it at 18. When I was still in high school, I was elected, and managed college, and then a job after that. We've got to get more young people to say, and not that they have to run for office, but to view civic engagement, whether it's at a local level, on a community board, or being involved in a political party, maybe running for office, having maybe a career in government service. Don't have to be elected. There are a lot of great careers, but I think there's almost a looking down on civic responsibility, and to me, if we could figure out how to instill that as early as possible, and I think our state curriculum an education system has to be a part of that. I would add that as a number 3.
I appreciate that. I couldn't agree more on the last one particularly. Thank you for this extraordinary conversation. Now I want to open it up to questions from folks in the room. I'm sure there will be a lot of them. We're going to have microphones. There you go in the back. Raise your hand, and here's a question to ask. You're comfortable. Eleanor?
Hi. Can we go back to pay to play just a minute and not talk about the campaign version of that, but you really oversee a pension plan worth, I think, $255 billion. Is that right?
Yep.
So how can you, and actually when you came into office, that was one of the big issues about how investors were chosen for those pension plans. How do you assure not only the pensioners, but also the rest of us, that that money is being invested fairly?
So, well, those are kind of 2 questions, right?
They are.
As Eleanor's want to do.
Always a dedicated
Yes,
journalist,
absolutely.
Right? They know how to get the second one in there.
Well, I really do have confidence that the system in place now works 99% of the time on the pay-to-play piece, which is an integrity piece, because 2 things. First of all, much of the problem of the Hevesy administration had to do with placement agents being the conduit for the money, and we unilaterally banned placement agents doing business with our fund. And what we require as part of any investment now is a signed attestment that no placement agent was used in that investment opportunity. And obviously, if they would lie, they would be sanctioned, and we wouldn't do business with them, and we'd pull back the money. And because of our saying that I wouldn't take money, campaign money, from people that work in finance, and we asked the SEC to make this a standard, and the SEC did that. So we started it. The SEC adopted it. So the policing of it, frankly, right now is the SEC. So if you are a if you're an investment firm and you have your principals giving money, you could be sanctioned by the SEC. So that has been a major deterrent. Has it eliminated all of it? It never. Human nature, we know from the Bible and from everything else that if there's a way to get around it, you can. We had our own slight problem with that briefly with somebody, but people are going to get caught. So I think as far as the pension integrity side of it, it's pretty clear, because there are folks that actually could give to me because they don't do business with us, don't want to do business with us, but they don't because they know at some point they might want to, and they'd be precluded from participating. It was similar to years ago when the banks were precluded. I forgot what the number was of that, the banking regulation. It kind of put a freeze on it, on any of those contributions. So now that we're saying, interesting question the way you phrased it, to ensure that pension fund investments are fair. So I will answer that by saying I'm assuming this is what you meant. Are we getting the best value for the opportunity? And that's where I have to rely on our professional staff, which I do have a lot of confidence in them. They are skilled professionals on investments. They work with consultants and advisors that guide us as well. If it's a private market, like a real estate transaction or private equity, we don't do hedge funds anymore, but real assets, hedge funds were a whole nother transparency issue. I have to sign off on it, and there has to be multiple signatures at various levels of our internal investment people. We set up an investment committee I don't want to get too technical, maybe more than you asked, but in prior to my time, we had silos. So you had like a real estate group and private equity group, and they did all the sign-ups. Well, now we have a committee made up of the different asset classes, and they challenge each other's recommendations before it ends up as a final recommendation to come to me. So there are multiple levels of sign-off. We report transactions on a monthly basis now, which wasn't done before. So if anybody wants to raise a question, or I mean, sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? So before, maybe once a year in the old CAFR, you could see where the money went. Well, now every month we report transactions. So again, trying to be transparent, having as many internal checks and balances to make sure that when an investment decision is being made, it is fair in terms of the return that we want to get to make sure we're going to have the money to pay for our retirees' pensions.
All right. Ma'am, over there. And then.
Hi, I'm Lisa Dagley, and I'm the Executive Director of the Permanent Citizens Advisory Committee to the MTA.
Yeah. Oh.
Our organization represents the riders on the MTA's subways, buses, Staten Island Rail, Long Island Railroad, and Metro North. And we are supporters of congestion pricing, not just for the benefits that it will bring to the region and to the riders through the investments in the capital plan, but also through the reductions in debt to the MTA and its effect on the operating budget. And you've done several reports on what that will mean. And my question is, what if you are looking at any or have done an analysis on what not having congestion pricing would mean to the debt service and the cost to the operating budget and any effects on service?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I'll point out Rahul Jain, who heads our New York City office, who's responsible for those different reports. So you should probably trade cards before the conversation. No, I don't doubt the MTA's estimate of a $15 billion hit as far as the agency's capital plan. I've often been asked, what's my opinion on congestion pricing? I was waiting for you to ask that one. And I pivot to, that's not my, with all due respect, that's not my responsibility to have, an opinion. What I do say, though, is if you're not going to have it, it puts a big hole in the capital plan, big impact on debt. So those that don't want it, what's the alternative? And no one's really come up with one. So I think the question for congestion pricing now is really the legal question. As you know, there are lawsuits out there. You have the board or the committee, whatever it's called, that is looking at how to implement it. A lot of folks would like certain exemptions. What will it mean? What will be the cost? How high will it? Will it be $23? I mean, that's not an assignment I would have ever taken. So it's going to be a challenge, but it'll get sorted out. So I'm going to assume that the legal issues will resolve in a way that will allow it to proceed. But I think overall question, we will continue to do our analysis. I think we have another one coming out soon. Yeah, the financial condition of the MTA. So what I want to say broadly about the MTA is, for the first time in a long time, they got the money. The federal money, the state money, congestion pricing, the fare increase, the toll increase. It's not an issue of the MTA not having enough money. The issue now, and I think Jano is up to it, is to ensure that they're spending the money in the right way. We'll continue to do our audits to help in that regard. But, the MTA has their own challenge in terms of their own savings plan, right? The $500 million each year. They have to make sure they meet those goals. Remember the prior transformation plan that was going to save all kinds of money did nothing, and we were the first ones to call that out. They ended up supposed to reduce overhead that wasn't necessary. Instead, they reduced operations positions, which didn't make any sense, so they abandoned that. So the MTA has to really stick to its own plan for efficiency, spend the money wisely, and we have to recognize, getting back to your point about these office buildings, they're not back to the ridership they need to be. The MTA in New York is more dependent than other public transit systems in our country on ridership. The reality is, for all the money we put in, we don't subsidize at the same percentage as I'm sure you're familiar with, as other metro cities do. So, I mean, rough, what are they now, give or take between the rail lines and the subways and the buses? 70%, give or take. They've really got to get to, in the next year or two, 80% if they're going to meet their numbers. So that gets back to, what is the quality of the ride? Is it safe? Is it clean? You have the crime issue, which is not solely under the purview of the MTA's responsibilities. But they need to do all that's within their power to make sure that it is a service that people will want to take advantage of, to utilize. And we do need the overall recovery to continue. We need folks to not be 100% remote, although some people can, and I know some people, that's what they want. I apologize to anybody that's listening in remotely and saying it's wonderful and I'm still in my pajamas listening to you. But for the city's economy, we do need it to come back, and we do need people back on the subways and the buses and the trains. And the first challenge there is the MTA doing it right, so people feel it's an experience I want to be a part of. Needless to say, not everybody feels that way right now for different reasons. So.
All right, ma'am, good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Catherine McVeigh Hughes, and I'm following up, I guess, on her question in terms of your portfolio investment. And with all the billions of dollars that the United States is actually spending, $23 billion unique events, where are you on freedom to invest and looking at climate risk, for our state and your portfolio, or the state's portfolio? Thank you.
How much time do we have?
So much as you want.
Yeah. So, well, we spend a lot of time with our portfolio on the climate issue. I'm going to spend on a lot of issues. I'll take, I guess, that question a couple ways. So there's this whole big raging debate about ESG and what is. From my perspective, whether it's climate or other environmental issues, or social issues like diversity in the workplace, or governance issues like how you do executive compensation, labor issues, and so on. Considering your portfolio investments in terms of those broad categories is really a way to look at de-risking your portfolio. You don't want to be invested in a company that has a terrible track record on environmental issues. You don't want to be invested in a company that has a litany of sexual harassments, lawsuits, pending. Particularly for the public equity side, where we're largely invested in index funds, we try to change those companies where we feel the corporate culture is not appropriate to what we think it should be, because we're not looking. If you divest from everything where there's a problem, all you'll be in is savings accounts, and you won't have enough money to pay the pension. So we want to stay engaged as an investor. In terms of your specific question on climate, my philosophy, and so I'll say our philosophy, has been very clear that climate change is not only an existential risk to the planet and to all of us, it's also an investment risk, and one that we need to deal with. So we had a decarbonization advisory panel, was the title of it, with the former governor, by the way, we set up. And they made a whole series of recommendations on how to address the issue. And that evolved into a climate action plan. We're actually the first public pension fund to have a climate action plan. It's on our website if anybody would like to see it. And it takes a combination of strategies. One of them is looking at your investments and perhaps changing some of your strategies. That could also include divesting from certain holdings, and we've done some of that, but also seizing on opportunities. So we've had a climate solutions and sustainable investment allocation of $20 billion, which we've now allocated all of that $20 billion. So stay tuned. There might be an announcement of some more money going there shortly. Climate Week coming up, hint, hint. And also continued engagement with our portfolio companies on issues like what is your carbon footprint? Are you disclosing greenhouse gas emissions? What is your plan? Your business plan, how does it comport with the goals of the Paris Agreement? So we've been very much an activist shareholder on climate issues. We continue to be. From my perspective, I think the most important thing that we do right now probably may not get as much attention as a shareholder resolution, or if we sell our holdings in coal, as we by and large did. It's really that other piece I mentioned, seizing the opportunities. There are risks. We want to be mindful of them, and we don't want to enhance those risks by going into certain investments. But there's also great opportunities now with the global economy moving in this direction to have a low carbon economy. I would like us to be on the ground floor of those opportunities. A lot of them have been more focused in Europe these days than the US, but we're starting to see more opportunities in terms of investment in renewables in the US as well. Because again, the challenge, whenever you talk about these issues, as worthy, as important as they are, Betsy taught me this from the beginning, I have a fiduciary responsibility. And I have to make sure, we have an investment return that we have to meet, that we're not having investments, as Eleanor's question suggested, that are compromised because of pay to play or any favoritism. So we've got to add into that, and I don't mind doing it, these various ESG factors. But I would just assure you, climate is probably, I don't want to say it's more important than the other factors, but it certainly is very much at the top of the list of our concerns. And certainly all these weather events and all the money we're spending on it means all of us, including pension funds, have to be part of the solution.
I just want to get one or two more in. Mr. Shaver?
Back to campaign finance. Citizens Union opposed the state system primarily on two grounds.
The amendment. The original one?
The original one.
The original one. And the
original
amendment
one.
too, right? Yeah.
But back to the original one, we opposed largely on the grounds that the contribution limits were still way too high, more than double the city limits. And secondly, that the oversight board was not independent. Would you favor lowering the contribution limits and reconstructing the board to be a truly independent board?
I mean, it's easy for me to say sure, because I have no role in it, right? So I would say this: don't let what is the expression? Don't let the good be the enemy of the perfect.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a real struggle to get anything in New York. Eleanor, how many times did you write about these things, right? Did I say it reverse? You know what I meant. I'm just pleased we finally have something on the books. And I guess what I would suggest, have whatever positions you want on it, but let's not trash the opportunity or to give people an excuse not to opt into it. Look, there's a system on the books. There's an amendment that you have concerns about. I don't know if the government's going to sign it or not. That's not clear to me. The dust will settle, though, soon enough. And I would suggest, with all due respect, I'm not a board member of Citizen Union, but pivot to asking everybody, are you opting in? Are you participating? If you're not participating, why are you not participating? Publicize to your membership and to the larger audience that you reach out to. These are the folks that won't participate, and raises the question of where they're getting their money. To me, I think that would be a more forward-looking way to address the challenge, rather than arguing over what woulda, shoulda, coulda. It's a lot better than what we had, that's for sure.
All right, I want to go to lightning round if we want to be respectful for time, but a bunch of people had their hands up. All right, right there.
I'd like to go back not to the last, but the one before it on climate. I'm curious whether state controllers like you ever get together and communicate about going after a company that maybe could be forced to change if it was even stronger than just the state of New York's pension fund coming in, but half a dozen others. I wonder how much you can collaborate and work together to really pressure.
On climate or broadly on ESG?
Well, I picked climate just because you had.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are a couple of venues in that regard. So we're part of the Council of Institutional Investors, which is not just pension funds, but endowments and other large institutional investors. So there is some communication that way. I'm also on the board of Ceres and part of the investor network on climate. So again, it's not just pension funds, but we do have regular collaboration, communication with our sister funds that are comparable to us in size. So that's New York City and the California funds. I mean, so we're the biggest players. On some other social issues, there are other controllers and treasurers that we collaborate with, again, through different organizations that convene. For instance, Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights does a lot on the S part of ESG that brings together controllers and treasurers as well. So there is a lot. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm pretty busy in New York, so I tend not to go to some of those conferences to talk to everybody else. But there are other ways that we communicate, and certainly at a staff level, there's a lot of communication. I would say on climate, though, the biggest platform in terms of sharing thoughts is through the Investor Network, through Ceres. And again, that's particularly with New York City and California, where we do. So that collaboration could be on shareholder resolutions, picking certain companies to try to pressure, with an engagement. It doesn't have to be a shareholder resolution. It could be other kinds of engagement, meetings, letter writings. So yeah, I mean, the short answer is there is collaboration. It tends to be mostly with the sister funds that are similar to our size.
Okay, final question.
Hi, I'm Sandy Lespinas, and I'm one of those New Yorkers that was like, why is he running for controller? But I'm so glad you did, because that's my pension. And in fact, all my friends, left, right, middle, we all love you. We don't have any complaints about you.
Wow.
That's the best question of the morning. Better than your questions, John.
Clearly,
But how do you deal with the extreme agenda of the parties, like with the left? Like, they want you to divest immediately at one point, and you were like, no, I want to take my time. How do you deal with that? Thank you.
So it's a fair question, and it's a struggle sometimes, because we do live in a time where people like to sometimes oversimplify the issues. If I thought that selling all of our stock in certain oil companies was going to solve the climate crisis, I'd be happy to do it, right? But it is more complex than that, and at the end of the day, I have to feel, and my team has to feel, that our pensioners will benefit by whatever decisions we make. So it's a balancing act, and it's not always easy or as smooth as I'd like it to be, and sometimes folks don't want to hear a more nuanced answer to those kind of questions. And by the way, other folks, and I'm not questioning it, take a different position. Even folks in my position, where they've done certain divestments that I wouldn't do. And by the way, I've probably done one or two divestments on one or two things that maybe other people wouldn't agree with. But you always have to have a rationale. You always have to bring it back to fiduciary responsibility as you define it, and be open and transparent about it. So I think, the advantage for me, in a sense, I don't want to date myself, but I've been around a while. So there's a lot of stuff now that's like, you know what? I know what I'm here for. I know what my inner compass tells me. I've had a great run in public service. If it ends tomorrow, it's okay. I'm very content with who I am and what I've done. Want to keep doing it, but I don't break out in a sweat very much anymore. The chips will fall where they may, and the way I've done it, I'm clearly not the flashiest guy around. I may not be the best known public official, but I do end up with more votes. There are reasons for that, but I'll get into that another time. But and it's all above board. But I I love public service, and with all the complexity and challenge and all the difficult people that you sometimes run into, I really think we're in a time where, because a lot of my friends say, you've been doing it long enough, collect that pension you've been safeguarding for everybody else. Frankly, that's not me. And I think when the times are tough, folks like me that kind of were ideally, we were talking about Robert Kennedy before. I mean, that's why I became a Democrat, because of the Kennedys and Martin Luther King. I mean, I grew up in a good Republican household, but I said, this world is falling apart in the 1960s. We got to do things better. The world is falling apart again. And I don't want to be on the sidelines. And so my purview may be more limited than what someone else does with some other titles, but I still can effectuate change within my responsibility. And I appreciate what you said, because especially for our pensioners and our public workers, they pay attention to everything that I do more than anybody does. And having your confidence and confidence, that means the world to me. I'll end with one funny story on that. So a woman came up to me complaining about health insurance, and she was having a problem getting cut. And I said, okay, well, I don't do health insurance.
Yeah.
You know. Well, and she kept going after me. So, but you've got to help you. And I said, you can call the Department of Financial Services. You should call your local assembly member or senator. You know, they can advocate for you. That's not what I should. You are the controller. You control everything. You should be able to straighten this out for me. I had to say, the title doesn't really explain what it is that I do. There's a lot I don't control. But within my purview, I try to do the best I can. And I do it. I don't say I'm better than anybody else. I'm not. Mama never gave me a swelled head. So I don't go after people. That's not my style. If they're doing something wrong, we go after them. But I try to model the best behavior that I think a public servant should have. If others want to follow that model, great. If others don't, that's their problem. So, but I appreciate what you said. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for your time. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, John.